The winter of 1884 was not merely a season in Silver Creek, New Mexico territory, it was a verdict. The wind did not blow, it screamed, tearing down from the mountains with a ferocity that stripped the paint from clapboard houses and froze the breath in a man's lungs before he could speak. Snow lay thick and heavy like a burial shroud over the town, grey with soot and trampled by the hooves of desperate horses. In the center of the market square, a wooden platform had been hastily cleared of ice. A small crowd gathered, huddled in woolen coats and buffalo skins, stomping their boots to keep the feeling in their toes. They hadn't come for livestock or grain. They had come for the spectacle. Standing on the platform, shivering violently, was Mai Lin. She was 22 years old, though her eyes held the exhaustion of a woman 3 times that age. She did not belong to this stark, white landscape. She was dressed in a traditional cheongsam of deep crimson silk, padded with cotton but entirely insufficient for the biting cold. The high collar choked her, the intricate frog buttons felt like shackles. Her father, or rather, the man who held her debt note, a jagged-toothed cruel man named Amos, shoved her forward. "Look at her," Amos barked, his voice cracking in the frigid air. "Strong back. Good teeth. Obedient. A genuine quiet woman for any man tired of a nagging wife." The crowd murmured. They looked at her not as a person, but as a curiosity. "A Chinese widow," they whispered. "Bad luck." "She's cursed, ain't she?" a woman in the front row hissed, pulling her shawl tighter. 2 husbands dead in the rail camps. Buried in the snow. Barren, too, Amos admitted, though he tried to make it sound like a feature. No heavy belly to slow her down. She can cook, she can sew, and she knows her place. $10 takes her. No refund. Mai Lin stared at her feet, encased in thin, embroidered slippers that were slowly soaking through with melted snow. She clenched her hands at her sides to stop them from trembling. The shame was hotter than the cold. She remembered her mother saying that dignity was like a spine, once broken, it could not support you. Mai Lin felt her spine cracking under the weight of the stairs. She was meat. She was a bad omen. She was alone. $5, a voice called out. For the labor. She's worth 10. Amos argued. The crowd began to disperse, the cold winning out over their curiosity. Mai Lin closed her eyes, waiting for the blow, waiting to be dragged back to the cellar where she slept. Then, the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on packed snow silenced the murmurs. The crowd parted instinctively, a reaction born of fear. A man stepped forward. He was terrifyingly large, his shoulders broad enough to block out the weak winter sun. He wore a long, oilskin duster coat that had seen better years, and a low-slung gun belt that hugged his hips. The handle of the Colt revolver at his side was worn smooth, not from age, but from use. This was Arthur Thorne. They called him a gunslinger, a man who had sold his violence to the highest bidder until the blood became too much to wash off. Now, he lived in the high ridges, a ghost in the mountains. Arthur stopped at the edge of the platform. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but the lower half of his face was covered in a thick, dark beard that caught the snowflakes. He didn't look at Amos. He looked at Mai Lin. He saw the blue tinge of her lips. He saw the way the red silk shook. 10, Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble, like thunder trapped in a canyon. Amos blinked, surprised. 10? Gold? Arthur didn't answer. He reached into his coat with a gloved hand, produced a heavy coin, and flicked it through the air. It landed in the snow at Amos's feet. Deal, Arthur said. You sure, Thorne, a man from the crowd shouted. That one brings death. She's a widow twice over. Arthur ignored him. He stepped onto the platform, the wood groaning under his weight. He approached Mai Lin, who flinched, expecting a rough hand to grab her arm. Instead, Arthur began to unbutton his heavy duster. He shrugged it off, revealing a thick wool shirt and suspenders, and draped the massive coat over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of gun oil, pine, and horse, but it was instantly, mercifully warm. "Let's go," he said. Not a command, but a statement of fact. My Lin looked up at him, bewildered. "Where?" she whispered, her English accented but clear. "Home," he said. "Before you freeze to death." He turned and walked toward a wagon hitched to two massive draft horses, their breath pluming in the air. My Lin grabbed a small bundle, all she owned, a comb and a rusted locket, and followed the gunslinger into the snow. The ride was an agonizing crawl through a white purgatory. The wagon wheels crunched over ice and sank into fresh drifts. Arthur said nothing for the first hour. He focused on the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced paranoia of a man who had made many enemies. My Lin huddled in the massive coat, the leather seat beneath her freezing cold. She studied him from the corner of her eye. He was perhaps 35, though the lines around his eyes suggested he had lived 100 years of trouble. "Why?" she asked finally. The single word hung in the freezing air. Arthur didn't look at her. "Why what? Why by me? I am. I cannot give you sons. They said I am cursed." Arthur huffed, a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so dry. "I don't need sons. I have plenty. And I don't believe in curses. I believe in winter. And I believe a house without a woman is just a wooden box. I am to be a wife." She hesitated on the word. "You're to be a help," Arthur corrected. "I have 5 children. Their mother died when the fever came through 3 years ago. I can shoot a coin out of the air at 50 paces, but I can't braid hair and I can't make a home feel safe. They need soft hands. Not these." He lifted one hand from the reins, scarred and calloused. "I am not soft," My Lin said quietly. "Life has made me hard, Mr. Thorne." He glanced at her then, his eyes grey and piercing. "Good. You'll need to be hard to survive up here. It's the cruelty I want you to leave behind." They arrived at the ranch at dusk. It was a rugged structure of hewn logs tucked against the base of a granite cliff, sheltered from the worst of the wind. A barn stood to the right, smoke curling lazily from the chimney of the main house. Arthur pulled the horses up and set the brake. "Wait here." He walked to the front door. It wasn't locked. He pushed it open, and My Lin saw movement inside, small shadows scattering like mice. Arthur motioned for her to come. My Lin gathered the oversized coat around her and stepped down into the knee-deep snow. Her silk slippers were ruined, her feet numb blocks of ice. She climbed the porch steps and entered the house. It was warm, but chaotic. Clothes were strewn over chairs, dirty dishes were stacked on a heavy oak table. In the dim light of the fireplace, 5 pairs of eyes stared at her from the shadows of the room. "Come out," Arthur said gently. Slowly, they emerged. Jacob, the eldest at 12, looked at her with suspicion, his arms crossed over a chest too thin for the cold. Samuel, 10, stood behind him, silent and watchful. Thomas, 8, wiped a runny nose on his sleeve and blinked curiously. Lily, the only girl, was 6, her hair a tangled bird's nest of knots, clutching a rag doll. And Noah, just 4, hid behind Arthur's leg, peeking out with wide, fearful eyes. "This is My Lin," Arthur announced. "She's staying." "Is she a new mama?" Noah asked, his voice a tiny squeak. She's going to help us," Arthur said, avoiding the title. He turned to My Lin. "The loft is yours. I sleep in the back room. Boys in the main room, Lily has the alcove." My Lin looked at the children. They were dirty, their clothes mismatched and torn. They looked at her red silk dress and her foreign face with a mixture of awe and confusion. She saw the hunger in their eyes, not just for food, but for something they couldn't name. She bowed her head slightly. "Hello." No one answered. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, sealing them in together. The first week was a war of attrition. The children were like wild animals, skittish and untrusting. Jacob, in particular, watched her like a hawk, as if expecting her to steal the silver or hurt his siblings. My Lin struggled. The kitchen was foreign to her. There was no rice, no bok choy, no familiar spices. Just sacks of flour, beans, salted pork, and potatoes that had begun to sprout eyes. She tried to make biscuits, but they came out hard as stones. She tried to scrub the floors, but the water in the bucket froze if she left it too long near the door. One evening, for days in, she was attempting to make a stew. Her hands, still aching from the cold draft that seeped through the kitchen walls, were clumsy. She lifted the heavy cast iron pot from the hook above the fire. The handle was slick with grease. It slipped. The pot crashed onto the floorboards with a deafening clang. Hot broth and potatoes splattered everywhere, soaking into the wood, ruining the only meal of the day. The room went deadly silent. The children froze. Jacob flinched, stepping in front of Lily as if expecting a beating. My Lin stood paralyzed, horror washing over her. She knew what came next. She waited for the shouting, for the back of a hand, for the anger she had known with Amos and her past employers. The back door opened. Arthur stomped in, shaking snow from his beard. He stopped, looking at the mess on the floor, then at My Lin's terrified face. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He sighed, walked over to the wood box, and grabbed a shovel. He scooped the ruined vegetables into a bucket for the pigs, then grabbed a rag. "It's just stew," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly soft. I have wasted the food," My Lin stammered, waiting for the punishment. "I am clumsy. I am stupid." Arthur stood up, towering over her. He reached out, and she flinched. He paused, then slowly reached past her to grab a clean towel. He handed it to her. "You ain't stupid, My Lin. And you ain't clumsy. That pot weighs 20 pounds and you're half frozen. We have dried meat in the cellar. We won't starve." He looked her in the eye. "Nobody gets hit in this house for an accident. Do you understand?" My Lin stared at him, tears prickling her eyes, not from sadness, but from the shock of mercy. "Yes," she whispered. Arthur nodded and walked back out to the barn. That night, she sat by the fire, sewing a patch onto Thomas's trousers. The red cheongsam was packed away in her trunk. She now wore a grey wool dress Arthur had found in a trunk of his late wife's things. It was too big, but she belted it tight. Noah, the 4-year-old, crept over to her. He didn't speak. He just leaned his head against her knee. My Lin stiffened, then slowly, hesitantly, rested her hand on his hair. It was soft. He let out a content sigh. Something inside her, a knot tied tight by years of grief and survival, began to loosen. Winter deepened. The snow piled up to the window sills. The house became a ship adrift in a white ocean. The turning point came with the sickness. It started with Lily. A cough that sounded like barking, followed by a fever that burned hot to the touch. By midnight, the little girl was thrashing, unable to breathe, her throat closing up. Arthur was frantic. He paced the floor, his face pale. "I can't lose her," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. "Not her too." "Get me water," My Lin commanded. Her voice was sharp, authoritative for the first time. "Boiling water. And bring me the whiskey and the jar of dried leaves from my trunk." Arthur didn't argue. He ran. My Lin took charge. She didn't know Western medicine, but she knew the old ways of her grandmother. She crushed the dried mint and willow bark she had saved, mixing it into a paste. She steamed the room, draping a blanket over Lily's head and the bowl of hot water to clear her lungs. She sat on the edge of the bed for 14 hours straight. She sponged Lily's forehead with cool snow water. She hummed a Cantonese lullaby, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to cut through the panic in the room. Jacob and Samuel watched from the doorway, eyes wide. Arthur stood in the corner, cleaning his gun over and over, his eyes never leaving My Lin. When dawn broke, grey and cold, the fever broke with it. Lily took a deep, clear breath and opened her eyes. "Mama," she croaked. My Lin froze. She looked at Arthur. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, a mixture of relief and something bordering on reverence. "She needs sleep," My Lin said, her voice raspy. "And broth." She stood up to go to the kitchen, but her legs gave out from exhaustion. Arthur was there in a second, catching her before she hit the floor. His arms were like iron bands, steady and warm. "I've got you," he said. He helped her to a chair by the fire. "Rest. I'll make the broth." "But you cannot cook," she murmured, eyes drooping. "I'll learn," he said. When she woke hours later, there was a blanket tucked around her. On the small table beside her sat a cup of tea, strong and bitter, just the way she liked it, and a clumsy attempt at a biscuit. Under the cup was a piece of paper. "Thank you. A." The thaw began slowly. The days grew longer. The dynamic of the house shifted. My Lin was no longer the stranger in the red dress, she was the axis upon which the household turned. She cut the red silk cheongsam into strips. From the fabric, she sewed liners for the children's coats and ribbons for Lily's hair. The house began to change. It smelled of ginger and pine. The floors were scrubbed clean. The children changed, too. Jacob stopped scowling and started asking her how to track rabbits. Thomas brought her interesting rocks he found. And they all, one by one, started calling her Mama, not because they forgot their own mother, but because they needed one now, and she was there, fierce and steady. One afternoon, supplies ran critically low. The flour barrel was empty. "We have to go to town," Arthur said, checking the load in his revolver. He looked at My Lin. "You don't have to come. I know it's hard for you there." "I will come," My Lin said, tying her scarf tight. "You need help carrying the sacks. And I am done hiding." The ride to Silver Creek was silent, but comfortable. When they pulled the wagon onto the muddy main street, heads turned. The townspeople whispered. The gunslinger and his Chinese widow. They walked into the general store together. The shopkeeper, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, sneered as My Lin placed a list on the counter. "We don't serve your kind in here unless you have coin up front," Henderson spat, looking at My Lin. "And I heard you're living in sin up at the Thorn place." "Shameful." Arthur stepped forward. He didn't draw his gun. He simply leaned his hands on the counter. The wood creaked. The air in the shop seemed to drop 10 degrees. "This lady," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "is my wife in every way that matters to God. She is raising 5 children who would be dead or feral without her. You will weigh the flour, you will give us a fair price, and you will speak to her with the respect you would give the Queen of England. Or I will turn this shop into firewood." Henderson swallowed hard. His hand shook as he reached for the flour scoop. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. Of course." As they walked out, loaded with supplies, they ran into Amos, the man who had sold her. He was leaning against a post, picking his teeth. "Well, look at that," Amos drawled. "The barren ghost looks fed. You get your money's worth, Thorne? Or is she as useless in the bed as she is at making babies?" My Lin stopped. Her face burned. But before she could look down, she felt Arthur's hand on the small of her back. Steadying her. Claiming her. Arthur looked at Amos with cold amusement. "She's got more fire in her little finger than you have in your whole wretched life, Amos. If you ever speak to her again, I'll bury you where you stand." They climbed into the wagon. As they pulled away, My Lin looked at Arthur. "You called me your wife," she said softly. Arthur kept his eyes on the road, but the tips of his ears turned pink above his beard. "I don't like liars, My Lin. And I don't intend to be 1 inch." Spring was fighting to break through the frost when the trouble came to the ranch. Arthur was a mile out, mending the north fence line which had been crushed by a fallen pine. My Lin was in the yard, hanging laundry on the line. The white sheet snapped in the breeze. She heard the horse before she saw it. She turned, shading her eyes against the glare of the snow. A rider approached. It was Harlan, a drifter known for drinking too much cheap whiskey and causing trouble in the saloons. He swayed in his saddle, his face flushed red with drink. "Well, hello there," Harlan slurred, sliding off his horse. He stumbled toward the gate. "Old man Thorne left the prize unguarded, did he?" "Go away," My Lin said, backing up toward the porch where the shotgun leaned against the wall. "Arthur will be back soon." "Arthur's a mile out," Harlan grinned, showing yellow teeth. "I saw him. Gives us plenty of time." He pushed through the gate. He was big, heavy with fat and muscle. My Lin turned to run for the gun, but he was faster than he looked. He lunged, grabbing her wrist. His grip was wet and bruising. "Don't run, little doll," he hissed, his breath reeking of rot-gut spirits. "I always wondered what a China doll feels like. They say you're cold. I bet I can warm you up." My Lin screamed, twisting her arm, scratching at his face. "Let me go. Stop fighting." He raised a hand to strike her. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. A bullet struck the dirt inches from Harlan's boot, kicking up a spray of mud. Harlan froze. Arthur stood at the edge of the clearing. He had ridden his horse hard, the beast was foaming. He held his Winchester rifle leveled at Harlan's chest. His face was a mask of absolute, lethal fury. "Let her go." Harlan released her instantly, holding his hands up. "Now, Thorne, I was just being neighborly." Arthur didn't speak. He strode forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He didn't shoot. He reversed the rifle, gripping the barrel, and swung the stock. It connected with Harlan's jaw with a sickening crunch. The drunk man crumpled to the snow, unconscious before he hit the ground. Arthur stood over him, chest heaving. He looked ready to kill the man right there. Then, he dropped the rifle and turned to My Lin. He checked her frantically. "Did he hurt you? Did he touch you?" My Lin was shaking, clutching her wrist where a bruise was already forming. I am okay. He just grabbed my arm." Arthur took her hand, his touch gentle as a feather. He inspected the red marks. A darkness passed over his face, guilt, rage, fear. "I should have been here," he rasped. "I promised you were safe." "You came," she whispered. "You came back." Arthur pulled her into his chest. For the first time, he hugged her. Not as a protector, but as a man who needed to hold her to know she was real. He smelled of cold air and sweat, and to My Lin, it was the best smell in the world. He tied Harlan up and threw him over his horse, sending the animal trotting back toward town with a note pinned to the drunk's coat for the sheriff. That night, Arthur sat by the fire, icing his knuckles. My Lin brought a bowl of warm water and a cloth. She knelt beside him, taking his hand. "You hurt your hand," she said softly, dabbing at a cut on his knuckle. "He's lucky I didn't kill him," Arthur muttered. "You are a dangerous man, Arthur Thorne." He looked at her, his eyes vulnerable. "Does that scare you?" My Lin traced the scars on his palm. "No. Because you are not dangerous to us. You are a fortress." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then, he leaned down and kissed her. It was tentative at first, rough with beard and hesitation, then deep and desperate. It was a seal on a promise made months ago in the snow. The final test of the winter came 2 weeks later. The snow was melting, turning the world to slush. Jacob was outside chopping firewood, trying to prove he was as strong as his father. The axe was heavy, the handle slick with melting ice. My Lin was in the kitchen kneading dough when she heard the scream. It was high, sharp, and terrified. "Mama! Dad!" She dropped the dough and ran, barefoot, into the mud. Arthur was already sprinting from the barn. Jacob lay by the woodpile, clutching his leg. The axe lay beside him, the blade bloody. He had missed the log and struck his shin. The snow around him was turning bright red. "Oh God," Arthur yelled, sliding to his knees. Jacob! The boy was pale, his eyes rolling back. It hurts. It hurts. Pressure! Arthur shouted, pressing his hands over the wound. Blood welled up between his fingers. My Lynn, get the needle. Get the whiskey. My Lynn didn't panic. Her world narrowed to the wound. She ran inside, grabbed her sewing kit, the one she had used to mend the cheongsam, and a bottle of alcohol. She ran back out. Move your hands, Arthur. He's bleeding out. I said move. Her voice cracked like a whip. Arthur pulled back. My Lynn poured the alcohol over the wound. Jacob screamed and thrashed. Hold him down, she ordered Arthur. Arthur pinned the boy's shoulders. Look at me, son. Look at me. Breathe. My Lynn threaded the needle. Her hands, which had once trembled with cold and fear, were now steady as stone. She pinched the skin together. Sorry, baby, sorry, she whispered as she pierced the skin. Stitch after stitch. Quick, precise, efficient. The bleeding slowed. The wound closed. She wrapped the leg tightly in clean linen. Jacob had stopped screaming and was now sobbing quietly, his face buried in the mud. My Lynn stroked his hair, her hand stained with his blood. It is over. You are safe. Mama has you. Jacob looked up at her, tears streaking his dirty face. Mama. Yes, Jacob. I am here. Arthur sat back on his heels, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his son, safe. He looked at the woman who had just saved him. He looked at the blood on her hands, hands he had once thought were too soft for this life. He reached out and took her bloody hand in his, pressing it to his lips. Blessed, he whispered. You are blessed. Spring finally broke the back of winter. The valley turned a vibrant green. Wildflowers pushed up through the earth where the snow had been. On the porch of the cabin, the family sat together. Jacob was limping, but walking. Lily was braiding My Lynn's hair, weaving blue ribbons into the black silk. Noah was asleep in Arthur's lap. My Lynn looked out over the valley. She wore a simple cotton dress now, but around her neck hung the locket Arthur had retrieved from the pawn shop in town, her mother's face. She wasn't the Chinese widow anymore. She wasn't the barren ghost. Arthur shifted, his arm coming to rest around her shoulders. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Thorne. My Lynn smiled, leaning into his warmth. I was thinking, she said, watching the wind ripple through the new grass, that I like the spring. But I am glad I came in the winter. Why's that? Because, she said, looking at the man who had bought her for $10 and given her a priceless life, the winter showed me who was strong enough to stay. Arthur pulled her closer. We aren't going anywhere, My Lynn. We're home.